It's a real pleasure to join the CAITEC 2025 China and International Development Forum today. Our theme, Empowerment and Change, could hardly be more timely given today's geopolitical realities. My name is Jonathan Glennie, Executive Director and founder of the Global Cooperation Institute, a think tank based here in Bogota and in London, dedicated to reimagining international cooperation and public finance for a changing world. And my work centres on mutuality, narrative renewal and system reform. My books, which some of you may have found interesting, The Trouble with Aid and The Future of Aid, Global Public Investment. And I'm really sorry I can't be with you in person for family reasons. Today I'll share insights from a recent paper I wrote for the UN called International Development Cooperation in 2025, Common Ground, Emerging Tensions and Ways Forward. And of course, China's leadership and experience make this an ideal setting to explore how a renewed cooperation system can empower countries, strengthen resilience, and support truly inclusive modernisation across the global south. Now, in 2015, I co-authored with Jose Antonio Alonso of Complutense University in Spain a paper called What is International Development Cooperation, which set out the purpose, modalities, and core characteristics of this unique concept, and it's still worth reading if you can get hold of it. And this year UN DESA invited me to write a kind of update, a new paper grappling with these questions and offering a framework for our deliberations that so many are looking at this year especially. So in this talk I'm going to present that paper to you, but I won't leave it at questions alone, because I think although I wrote the paper in quite a neutral way, for this occasion I'd like to go further and share briefly some of the answers that I think may be on the table. So in the paper I explore 5 big questions, and the way it's written is that we look at some convergences across all actors, common ground, and then some of the tensions that exist between different points of view. So let's take each question in turn. First, purpose. What is IDC for? Across the system there is strong convergence, I think, that the eradication of poverty must remain a central and indispensable purpose of international development cooperation. Countries also share the view that economic growth and to some extent structural transformation are essential to achieving lasting improvements in well-being. And at the same time there's a growing belief that cooperation should support countries navigating shared global challenges such as climate instability, pandemic risk, financial contagion, technological disruption, things that transcend borders. And yet significant tensions remain. Should international development cooperation also aim at reducing global inequality and accelerating convergence between countries, not just within them? And how should the financing of global public goods relate to the traditional redistributive logic of development cooperation? And increasingly, how should international development cooperation support green and digital transitions without creating new dependencies or forms of what is being known as green colonialism? Purpose, in other words, is not settled, it's evolving and demands political clarity as well as technical precision. And that leads us on to the second question, beneficiaries. Who should benefit and how do we define need? There is consensus, I think, that those living in extreme poverty and in the most vulnerable contexts require continued substantial support, so fragile and low-income countries remain priorities for concessional public finance. Yet the global distribution of poverty has shifted, and most of the world's poor now live in middle-income countries, depending on one's definition of poverty. And that raises questions, therefore, about country categories and human need, and between traditional allocation models and the realities of a world where vulnerabilities cut across income levels. Another unresolved question concerns who counts as a legitimate beneficiary in a world of shared risks. Should contributions to global public goods be seen as benefiting all countries equally? Or should need still dominate allocation choices? And how should cooperation recognise non-economic forms of vulnerability, such as exposure to climate shocks, demographic pressures, or weak global integration? The challenge is to balance fairness, effectiveness, and political feasibility in defining beneficiaries. Which brings us to the third question, financing. What resources and instruments are required? Now, there's a widespread agreement, I think, that concessional public finance remains indispensable, especially for low-income and fragile contexts, and for investments where private capital, whether for-profit or philanthropic, will not flow at scale. No serious actor believes that grants or highly concessional loans can be replaced by blended finance or guarantees alone. And yet profound tensions persist. What's the future of official development assistance, ODA, whose political legitimacy is weakening even as its developmental role remains vital? How can the world mobilise new public resources, including international taxation, SDR reallocation, innovative levies, without overburdening national budgets? Should debt relief be formally recognised as part of international development cooperation, given its transformative effect on fiscal space? And how should private capital be integrated without distorting development priorities or diverting scarce concessional resources into de-risking commercial investment? So financing is therefore not only about quantity, it's about fit-for-purpose instruments aligned with public goals in a deeply interdependent world. Fourth, governance. Who decides and how is legitimacy built? There is convergence, I think, that governance must become more inclusive and representative. A multipolar world cannot be governed by 20th century structures dominated by a small group of traditional donors. South-South cooperation, regional institutions and new development banks are expanding the ecosystem, creating pressure for shared decision-making. Yet tensions, again, remain unresolved. Who has the authority to define what counts as international development cooperation in a plural system? How should non-state actors, cities, civil society, indigenous groups, private innovators be meaningfully included, not merely consulted? And how can we reform global and regional institutions to reflect today's distribution of power, expertise and responsibility without fragmenting the system further? So the challenge is to balance legitimacy, coherence and plurality, recognising that governance must evolve alongside the changing global landscape. And finally, we come to effectiveness. The fifth question: what works and for whom? I think there's widespread frustration with fragmentation, duplication and administrative burden. There has been for decades. Countries want cooperation that is aligned with national priorities, predictable and genuinely supportive of local capability. Yet they also value diversity of partnerships and the ability to choose among multiple providers. And this produces a core unresolved tension. How can we strengthen coherence without imposing centralisation? Evidence continues to show that effectiveness depends on genuine ownership, long-term investment and attention to intangible outcomes such as dignity, respect and trust. Yet these remain undervalued in prevailing metrics. Effectiveness ultimately is not a technical question. It is deeply political, shaped by incentives, power and the quality of relationships at every level of cooperation. Together these convergences and tensions define the landscape we must navigate as we imagine a cooperation system capable of meeting the demands of a profoundly interdependent century. And this is where I'd like to share with you two related approaches that, in my view, could sit at the heart of the future international development cooperation system, both of which we're working on at the Global Cooperation Institute, namely global public investment and circular cooperation. At the core of the global public investment approach is the idea that cooperation will only thrive if it evolves in two fundamental ways: a narrative evolution and an institutional evolution. These are not cosmetic adjustments. They reshape both how we think about cooperation and how we practice it. The narrative evolution begins with an uncomfortable truth. The old story of us helping them, the language of aid, has lost credibility. It belongs to a world of clear hierarchies that no longer exists. In today's multipolar and deeply interconnected world, a narrative based on charity neither mobilises support in the north nor resonates with partners in the south. GPI replaces this with a narrative of mutual benefit. When we invest in global public goods, resilience, poverty reduction, shared prosperity, everyone gains. International public finance becomes a collective investment, not a one-way transfer. And this shift is not merely philosophical. A narrative grounded in mutual benefit unlocks more resources. Countries are far more willing to contribute when cooperation is framed as serving shared interests. And yes, their national interests. Finance ministries, parliaments and publics are easier to persuade when the returns are collective rather than charitable. But narrative change must be matched by institutional evolution. GPI calls for a shift from donor-recipient governance to mutuality, where all contribute, all benefit, and all participate in decision-making. And this shared governance has two powerful effects. First, it brings new resources from the South. Many middle-income countries already contribute, of course, through climate funds, South-South cooperation and regional banks, but they want a more equal voice. And when institutions reflect the realities of a multipolar world, contributions increase. And second, mutual decision-making leads to better spending. We know this. Decades of evidence show that genuine ownership, real power, not symbolic consultation, results in more efficient, contextualized and sustainable outcomes. In simple terms, mutuality delivers more value for every dollar invested. Crucially and importantly, these evolutions in narrative and institution restore dignity to cooperation, replacing hierarchies with shared endeavour, and that's what countries want. This is the promise of global public investment, not just more money, but better money, and a cooperation system that responds to the demand of countries and their people. And if GPI provides the new logic for big picture macro finance, then this idea of circular cooperation, I think, offers the complementary logic for how cooperation is practiced at the project level. For decades, cooperation has been shaped by a kind of north-south divide. Expertise assumed to flow one way, priorities set elsewhere, success judged by someone else's metrics. And circular cooperation breaks with this. It begins from the principle that every country, no matter where it is on the development ladder as it's known, has something to learn and something to offer, and that development challenges from climate to AI to health are now shared. Circular cooperation builds mutual learning ecosystems where governments, researchers and communities exchange solutions in a circular fashion, everyone benefiting and everyone contributing. In a world of interconnected risks, this shift transforms fragmented projects into collaborative problem-solving systems, making cooperation more relevant, more effective, and yes, again, more dignified. Finally, let me just reflect on China's leadership, which is central to the evolution I've described. China's own development journey has lifted hundreds of millions from poverty, transformed productive capacity, and demonstrated the power of long-term investment in people and institutions. And China's approach to international cooperation, rooted in principles of mutual benefit, respect for sovereignty and practical problem solving, already aligns closely with the logic of global public investment and circular cooperation. Of course, China is very far from perfect, both at home and abroad, but as power becomes more widely distributed across the world, China's commitment to multilateralism and South-South cooperation positions it as a key architect of a more inclusive global system. GPI's emphasis on shared decision-making resonates strongly with China's call for a more balanced global governance, and circular cooperation echoes China's long-standing practice of learning and knowledge exchange across the global south, especially through agriculture, infrastructure and technology partnerships. So I invite those of you at this conference today, and those who may be watching this video online, to explore the global public investment and circular cooperation approaches as you deliberate these big questions about the future of international development cooperation in the 21st century. And thanks very much for listening.